We need to travel west to West Africa so we can understand exactly what was happening in this period. What period am I talking about exactly? So, from around 600 AD, we have people writing about the people in West Africa and how they operated their courts. In order for us to understand this, we have to get rid of mythology, because mythology massages the mind and leaves holes in understanding. In reference to West Africa, I'm talking about the entire west of Africa, including parts of the north. But for this video, I will be talking specifically about the areas that have this one trait that I'm about to mention in common. Since I mentioned Bodwick T. Edward a long time ago, something that has always tickled my brain is the fact that no matter how sophisticated the writings of the people who write about the people in West Africa are, it seems to stranger the ideas of Africa to more and more people, even though they have writings written by people who are familial to them. What we are going to talk about now is the system of law that was used in West Africa. And it seems to be throughout West Africa, as several people who came from several parts of the world talked about the fairness of the system in that area and how lenient it is to the citizens. This system seems to have been shared also in locations like the Kingdom of Congo, although I will not be talking about it in this video. Now, having said that, it is completely unique to West Africa. The systems and laws that were in the Swahili coast were both independent and also had a Arabic bend towards them. And when the Portuguese came, it had a Portuguese bend towards them. So, this is a very unique system. The fact that they were Muslim didn't change anything for some of the people in West Africa. And we know this because a lot of the tribes that are talked about having these laws are themselves independent, or what they call them those days, idol worshippers. And speaking of worship, we know that the thing that informs their court systems back in the day was their religion. And that is where we should start. Thomas Jefferson Bowen, not to be mistaken with Thomas Jefferson, the president, was a completely unique character. He went to the Nigerian regions, China, and several other countries to preach baptism as a missionary. This is interesting because he wrote a couple books in the 1800s. One of his books involves the culture of the people located in West Africa, different tribes at the same time. What this showed is that there was a convergence of culture in that region. Like all European people who lived in America, he had his prejudices, and I think it's fair to say that in a lot of ways he was racist towards black people in some of the words that he speaks. But if we look at the parts where he speaks highly about Africans in his book, Adventures and Missionary Labors in Several Countries in the Interior of Africa from 1849, and it was published in 1856, we will see that he gives a pretty detailed account of how the laws worked. Now, I want to specify one of the earliest books that you get from any culture are law books, like the book that I told you about from Mozambique. That was a book of law. The books in Swahili, a lot of them are books of law. Most books that you get from around the world are books of law. But we also know that most countries operated from a kingship point of view, where the king makes all the dictates and basically his underlings say exactly what is and what is not a crime. And then, of course, there's a high bias and corruption. But in order to run a state properly, you must reduce corruption and have some fair rules. And this is what these West Africans were trying to do. Some of it was lining up with the Islamic beliefs that poor people should be treated as fair as rich people, and some of it was just lining up with the native beliefs on the native system on how to climb and how to work the operations, including using the cowrie shells as money in order to have fair exchange within the country. As we read, the civil officers are the king at Ewe and his counselors, and the governors and their counselors in various towns. At present, the towns are nearly independent of the king and manage their affairs very much in their own way. The military officers are generals and others of various inferior ranks. Laws are made in each town by the chief and his counselors, but sometimes they call a public meeting of the people. Neither the king nor any governor or chief in the country is arbitrary above the law. The ruler can do nothing without the assent of his council, and the ruler and council together cannot violate the ancient traditional laws of the country. Whatever despotic acts may be witnessed in Africa, they are all performed according to the common law of the land, the origin of which is lost in the immeasurable depths of antiquity. The only tax of which I have heard is the toll paid in cowries from merchandise which enters the town, and sometimes a small tax on corn which is paid in kind to the gatekeepers as the farmers bring in their crops. Public labors, as the building of the town walls, are performed by the people without remunerations. Judicial proceedings are of two kinds. First, before the ruler of the town and his council, according to law and testimony, and secondly, before the Oboni Lodge, a sort of Freemason institution, who are connected with the government on one hand and with the religion of the country on the other. The Oboni house has three courts into the interior, or third of which no uninitiated person may enter under penalty of death. When a person is initiated, he has to kneel down and drink a mixture of blood and water from a hole in the earth. But what else he is required to do, I am not informed. The business of the Obonis being transacted in secret, I have no knowledge of their method of trying cases when they sit as a court. They are feared by the mightiest men in the country. Criminals are executed by beheading or strangling with a rope. At Horin, they break their necks with a mace or iron cudgel. The capital offenses are murder, treason, and house burning. In some places, theft, robbery, and adultery. Minor offenses are punished by fine and imprisonment, rarely by whipping. This later description of these African tribes and African kingdoms is not something small, as Baldwick T. Edward also gave the same description about the Asante. Now, it is important to understand, because some people would say, so what? It is important to understand that Egypt didn't work this way, ancient or contemporary to this kingdom. They worked completely from top down. The breakdown from city to city, being able to have laws that completely violate the other laws. In other words, they were almost like the United States in the sense that they could have their own law depending on the province. This is something that is unknown to a lot of areas around the world unless they have democracy like the Iroquois or they have free states like those you see in confederations. But this is not as a result of confederations. As we can see, some of these are, they have the exact same king, but they break down into chiefdoms, and those chiefs can have their immediate circles decide what laws are suitable for their people. It's difficult to tell the story of West Africa because, of course, West Africa is very different than the rest of Africa. In my opinion, it is probably the most complex place in history. In some ways, their laws were sexist, but in some ways, the laws protected women above men. In some ways, their laws were degenerative, as in the case of slavery, but in some cases, they gave complete freedom to the people. In some ways, they were very literate and could write pretty much anything and completely understood leniency, as you can see in one case where he talked about how they use fines as a form of punishment instead of just going straight to death, as a lot of places around the world did. And then, of course, the dedication of giant buildings to the law specifically. As you saw written down there, they would create buildings solely for the purposes of creating courtrooms to discuss the law. Now, of course, they mentioned that there was two different factions that decided. It wasn't one judge. There was a court, a religious court, in which they would counsel and talk, and this would be wise men of the world, and then there would be the people who represent the chiefs. While this is a broad summary of their law, it's important to understand that these people had more than 1,000 different laws and how they should be punished and what price is put on it and what fair is fair and what's unfair. And to understand that, in order to play a game, if we consider life as a game, you need fair rules. And this changes everything when it comes to reality. I mean, think about the fact that whatever country you're in, if you do not know the rules, yet if you break them, you will be punished severely, that is very unfair. In this civilization, unlike others which were very biased, you wouldn't rush into somebody that you shouldn't have rushed into and then get your head removed. Instead, there would be counsel, there would be all kinds of conversation about it, and maybe you might pay a fine for being above your station, but nothing as big or as treacherous as what was going on in Europe or Asia, or I'd even go as far as to say some parts of the Swahili coast. All these laws were concentrated when it came to the Asante. You could see that clearly in the Asante there was a true understanding of where this came from. But, like that guy wrote, even in the 1800s, it was lost to antiquity why the courts operated that way. Now, I made a video a long time ago called The Confederacy of the Asante. This was a very important video, and I wanted the people to keep that in mind when we talk about the history of Africa. And this is a piece of it. The king, the aristocracy, now reduced to four, and the assembly of captains, are the three states of the Ashanti government. The constitution requires or admits an interference of the aristocracy in all foreign politics, extending even to the veto on the king's decision. But they watch rather than share the domestic administration, generally influencing it by their own opinion, but never appearing to control it from authority. And their opinions on civil questions are submitted with a deference directly in contrast to their bold declarations on the subject of war or tribute, which amount to injunction. The Ashantis advocate this constitution by the argument that the interference of the aristocracy in all foreign politics makes the nation more formidable to its enemies, who feel they cannot provoke with impunity where there are so many guardians of the military glory who, by insisting on a war, become responsible in a great degree for the issue, and pledge an energy and exertion in comparison with which such as could be excited by a despotic monarch must be deemed disinterested. They added that almost independent administrations of the king was better calculated for the domestic government because the decrees of a monarch have naturally more force with the people over whom his power is unlimited, and further that a civil power in the aristocracy could not be reconciled to the assembly of captains, to whom the former estate was already sufficiently invidious for the health of the Constitution. So, to explain what he's talking about here, we have to understand that he's not talking about a concentration of power. He's talking about a division of powers so that the people themselves basically have the power and the law is not as concentrated in the hands of some kind of deep evil. This is very different and very fair compared to what was around in other civilizations, with exceptions, of course. Now, why do we care that this is real? Why do we care that this happened? Well, it's because of the word savagery. A lot of people have always assumed that Africa's history and even some of their monuments are accidental or even just something that was borrowed from somewhere else. But understanding that they have a history that is sophisticated and completely separate from other people is paramount. So what do I mean? Well, let's take the modern world. So some people they ask the question, okay, would you rather live in the modern world or would you rather live in ancient Africa law-wise? Everybody was not free in the olden days, and the laws today are more fair. The only way you could believe that is if you know nothing about history. If you know something about history, you will understand that even going back to ancient times, there were places which made the law very fair. Now, of course, the situation and the biggest thing that could happen to you is that you could get the death penalty, perhaps not even for taking someone's life, which could be seen as very unfair. But this is only a small jump away from the civilizations we have today. Think about it. In most of the nations that we see today, I mean, one of the biggest is America, we still have the death penalty. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying that other places in history were just these vicious areas where, you get caught picking something up that you shouldn't and then they take your head. But I'm also telling you that there were places like that in history, and this is not one of them. Now, before I read the next part, you have to understand why there would be a chapter on intellect. The reason for this is very interesting. One, this was still the part where they were debating whether or not human beings deserved any rights at all in America. And interestingly, people who had never been to Africa had one opinion, and then as soon as they landed, as you will see here, they have a completely different opinion of what Africans are and what they hold within their kingdoms. Remember, like I said, their opinion when they're in America is these people don't deserve any rights. What have they contributed to society? Blah, 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 blah. Even though they were literally slaves, so they contributed a lot. But the people who eventually came to Africa, who were taught their whole life that these people had no real civilizations in Africa, would instantly say something like this. The existence and constant use of the term for this expression of thought are certainly good evidence that the people think. The Yoruba language affords all the terms necessary for a full and clear declaration of the gospel, as for instance, a word of God, angel, heaven, hell, sin, guilt, atonement, mediation, repentance, faith, pardon, justification, sanctification, both objective and subjective, a distinctive word for each adoption, salvation, purgation, etc. The reason why they pay such deep attention to preaching as constantly reported by the missionaries is that they understand what the gospel teaches. There are various other indications of the fact that the people are not deficient in intellect. One of these we find in their government and laws. The highest excellence of the best governments among white people consist in constitutional checks or limit to prevent abuses of power. Strange as it may seem, the Central Africans had studied out this balance of power and reduced it to practice long before our fathers settled in America, before the barons of England and extorted the Great Charter from King John. The the pure and correct theism, which rises far above the superstitions of the people, is another proof of their mental soundness. Even their idolatry, while it is substantially the same as that of the Assyrian Greeks and Rome, has not been loaded with such puerile fancies and debasing dogmas as were common at Corinth and Athens. These points will be further noticed under the heads of government and religion. No one can live among the people and speak their language without being convinced that they have a good share of sober common sense. They are shrewd observers of character and motives. I have frequently been surprised at the readiness with which they form correct notions of the missionaries who go into their country. All of us would be surprised if we knew what they think and say of us. I don't actually need to reinterpret those words, but I think they speak very well for themselves. Two things that I will say as a return or a understanding of those words. One, again, I must state that this person is not free of racism. He says a lot of things that are racist. He says a lot of things that he would probably never say today if he lived in the modern world. And why? Why does he say this? Well, it's because he's being as honest as possible about what he is seeing, and it is going against everything he believes. A second point is the understanding that this area of Africa has got fairer laws than that of Europe and the Americas and other places, and it had it sooner, and it came completely out of a pure natural, a pure independent thinking made by the people. This is important. And the reason why it is important is because there's a lot of people who always talk about Pan Africanism and going back to Africa. And the question is, what are we going back to? This is a very good question. What are we going back to? Are we going back to when kings ruled? Are we going back to, are we going to abandon a lot of the rules that have been blessed by it being maintained by the Western world and then spread throughout the earth? And the answer is there's so many good things to pluck out of African history that has just been abandoned, which is probably more natural towards the civilizations, where it feels like something is missing, something doesn't hit correctly. By the way, this person speaks about the tribes and the people in Brazil and the tribes and the people in the Americas, for example, the Liberians in Monrovia, who went back to Africa and had different laws. And that's probably something we'll talk about in another video. But something that he does bring up is how common that, the laws of this region would be adopted in Brazil. And this is where we come together as a civilization and understand that Africans took Africa wherever they went, whether it is the villages or the quilombos. Thank you for watching the video. Next time.